King Ethelred and Alfred swiftly raised armies from all parts of Wessex. This was done by dispatching messengers to the chief nobles, ealdormen of each kingdom. The ealdormen raised the feared, or local army, by summoning the lesser nobility. The more land a noble had, the more men he had to provide. Once assembled, the army was dispatched to Nottingham. The Vikings had taken up a strong defensive position within Nottingham. As the Mercians and Saxons could not breach the defences, a peace treaty was established. Ethelred and Alfred took their forces back to Wessex. The Vikings withdrew back to Northumbria to winter in the city of York. No side had gained any real advantage, and no lasting peace could be possible. In 870 AD, the Viking army left York. Passing through Mercia, it entered the kingdom of East Anglia. In a fierce battle, King Edmund of the East Angles was killed and his army defeated. The Vikings rapidly subjugated the entire kingdom. With much of Northumbria and all of East Anglia in their control, the Vikings looked triumphantly towards Wessex. Viking influence in England had reached a dangerous point of expansion. Northumbria and East Anglia were under Viking power. Kent and Mercia were vulnerable to attack and had tried to buy peace. Wessex was still largely untouched by the raiders. If it fell, the plunder opportunities would be great. In 871 AD, the Viking leader Halfdan determined on a plan to strike at the heart of his enemies. First, his land force rode to Reading to establish a stronghold. Then his fleet with supplies and reinforcements sailed up the Thames. He could now strike south or west using the River Thames and River Kennet. Halfdan's plans went well initially. Reading was taken and a moat and rampart swiftly constructed to secure the Viking base. Halfdan knew that Saxon scouts would have followed his march. He prepared his forces for the inevitable Saxon onslaught. Sure enough, Ethelred and Alfred were energetically assembling their forces within striking distance. When Halfdan sent out a force to forage and scout, they encountered a Saxon army and were defeated. Their morale at fever pitch, the Saxon forces advanced on the Viking stronghold at Reading. The battle was hard, prolonged, and bloody. Despite their determined efforts, the Saxons were unable to storm the ferociously defended ramparts. When the Vikings burst out of their stronghold in a bold counterattack, the Saxons broke and fled. Viking military expertise had triumphed. Both Alfred and his brother escaped the carnage. They both now desperately set about reorganizing their armies before the Vikings could exploit the fruits of victory. Incredibly, within 4 days, the Saxons had assembled a fresh army to threaten Halfdan. The Viking forces had left Reading to attack the rich monastery at Abington. The Saxon army intercepted them at Ashdown. Alfred's biographer Asser recalled vividly the ensuing conflict.
Alfred and his forces reached the field sooner and in better order than his brother. King Ethelred was still in his tent at prayer. The faith of the Christian king counted for much with our Lord God, as shall be illustrated by what follows. Alfred could not confront the enemy's shield wall any longer without retiring or attacking before his brother reached the field. He finally deployed the Christian forces against the enemy, even though the king had not come. Acting bravely, like a wild boar, and strengthened by divine assistance, he closed his shield wall in good order and attacked without delay.
Despite having to attack uphill and against a superior force, Alfred's men followed him. The Vikings were caught off guard by the impetuosity of the Saxon assault, as Asser recorded with grim satisfaction.
The Vikings had taken the superior position. The armies clashed where a small thorn tree grows, with a great shout from all. One side fought wrongfully, the other for life, family, and country. Both sides fought resolutely and fiercely, to and fro, until, by divine judgment, the Vikings were no longer able to withstand the Christian onslaught. One of 2 Viking kings, 5 earls, and many thousands of Vikings were cut down and the army put to flight until they reached the stronghold whence they had come. The Christians pursued them until darkness fell, killing all they found.
The victory at Ashdown established Alfred's reputation as a brave warrior and good general. His solo attack on the Viking army had unsettled them enough for his brother to press home the advantage. Within 2 weeks, the West Saxons were in action again. Fortune did not smile on them. King Ethelred and Alfred were defeated. Both armies continued to campaign, marching through Wiltshire and Hampshire. In a bloody engagement at Meriton, the Saxon army was once more bested by the Vikings. King Ethelred died soon after, possibly from wounds received in battle. At the age of 23, Alfred, youngest son of Ethelwulf, was proclaimed king. Within a month, he was once more in the field. Disturbing news had reached him that a fresh Viking army had reached English shores. Led by Guthrum, who was to be Alfred's main foe in the coming years, the Vikings marched into Wessex. King Alfred confronted the Vikings at Wilton. At first, the day seemed to go in the Saxons' favor. The Vikings retreated in the face of a determined attack. The Saxons pursued them, only to be themselves overwhelmed in turn. In the course of the year 871 AD, thousands of Saxons and Vikings had fallen. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles recorded 9 major battles and an uncounted number of skirmishes. Both sides had fought to the point of exhaustion. The grievous losses they had suffered left neither side in a position to continue. Before the winter snows began, the Vikings pulled back to London. An uneasy peace descended on the beleaguered kingdom of Wessex. There was much for King Alfred to do. He had to re-establish his government over areas the Vikings had overrun. He had to reconstruct the administration to assess taxes and tributes. Most importantly, he had to rebuild his military machine as rapidly as possible. At any moment, his scouts might report a marauding Viking force. King Alfred took on the burdens of his kingdom with great fortitude.
At his wedding, the king was seized by a severe illness, which plagued him incessantly by day and night for 25 years. Whenever, through the grace of our Redeemer, the illness was waning for a day or night, or even for the space of an hour, the king's terror of the accursed agony remained.
The Vikings were not idle. Forcing the Mercians to pay them off in 872, the Vikings returned to Northumbria. Quickly re-establishing a puppet government there, they turned their attention south. Despite the payment of more money, or Danegeld, the Vikings swept into Mercia. By 874 AD, they had bloodily defeated the Mercians and deposed their king, Burgred. The Vikings now ruled all of northern and most of Midland England. Halfdan's army had been fighting in England for 9 years. Now land was granted to those of his men who wished to settle in Northumbria. The Viking army that had arrived in 871 AD had no such peaceful intentions. They looked once more to the kingdom of Wessex. In 874, Guthrum marched his army to Cambridge for his forthcoming assault. From 875 to 877, the Vikings twice invaded Wessex. On both occasions, they allowed themselves to be bought off. By 878, Guthrum was determined on conquest and summoned his warlords. Guthrum knew the importance his enemies attached to the Christmas festival. He knew that the Saxon armies would be unprepared. King Alfred's defeat and escape left his people with few choices. Although some resisted, the great majority could not. Some chose to leave Wessex and flee abroad. For most of the people, submission to the Vikings was the only option. Alfred's exile at the stronghold of Athelney lasted for 5 months. Yet the 5 months he spent in the midst of the Somerset marshes became the most famous period of his reign. The enduring myths of King Alfred come from this time and reinforce stories of his fortitude, piety, fairness, and courage. The most celebrated of these stories was the burning of the cakes. In this story, King Alfred, in his wretched, anonymous state, took refuge in a swineherd's hut. He was entrusted by the swineherd's wife to watch over some small loaves she was baking. King Alfred was so preoccupied with his woes that he neglected his job. The loaves were burnt, and the swineherd's wife scolded him bitterly. Over the centuries, the story was embellished to show the king's humility and fortitude. The other tale further reinforces the widely held belief in King Alfred's personal bravery. Depending on the version, King Alfred alone, or accompanied by a single faithful servant, left Athelney disguised as a minstrel. He travelled to Guthrum's stronghold and gained entry. That night, he so captivated the Vikings with his singing that they persuaded him to stay. During his few days in their camp, he roamed freely amongst his enemies. When he left, he had gathered much useful information about their strength and plans. The Vikings had even paid him for his services. Whatever the truth may be, it is certain that King Alfred used his time on the run to plan carefully. Word soon spread amongst the West Saxons that their king was alive. The Anglo-Saxon devotion to loyalty to their king remained strong. Secretly, the West Saxons made their preparations. King Alfred's supporters sallied out from Athelney in a series of ambushes and attacks. Slowly but surely, the initiative the Vikings had won at Chippenham was wrested from them. In May 878, King Alfred summoned his forces to muster at Egbert's Stone. The Feards of Wiltshire, Somerset and Hampshire hurried to join him. Leaving the Dorset and Devon Feards to guard his rear, King Alfred's army marched. 2 days later, King Alfred confronted Guthrum, who had hastily prepared a defensive position near Warminster. In the contest of arms that followed, the Saxons were victorious. Despite heavy casualties, the Vikings were able to make a fighting withdrawal to Chippenham. Asser once again carefully recorded the events that followed.
King Alfred boldly made camp in front of the Viking stronghold with his army. After he had been there for 14 days, the Vikings, totally worn out by hunger, cold, fear, and in finally despair, sued for peace. Alfred could take as many hostages as he chose and give none in return. Never before had the heathens made peace under such terms. In addition, they swore they would leave the kingdom at once. Also, Guthrum promised to embrace the Christian faith and receive baptism from King Alfred's own hand. All the promises the Vikings made, they kept. 3 weeks later, Guthrum and 30 of his best men were baptized, and Alfred received him as an adoptive son. Guthrum remained 12 days with Alfred, and Alfred bestowed gifts of treasure upon him. In the year of our Lord's incarnation, 879, the Viking army left Chippenham as promised.